Welcome to today's webinar. While we're diving into one of the most complex and rapidly evolving areas in healthcare combination products. My name is Rob Schultz, and I'll be hosting today's sessions. I am the Senior Vice President of Consulting Services at Suttons Creek. I have over 2 decades of experience in the medical device and pharmaceutical industries, including over 12 years in regulatory affairs for combination products at companies such as Allergan, Amgen, and Suttons Creek, where I've supported dozens of development projects and regulatory approvals. Over the next hours, we're bringing together 3 experts whose perspectives span regulatory strategy, quality management, and systems engineering, because combination products demand all 3 disciplines speaking the same language. Today, we'll unpack 4 critical areas shaping the future of combination product oversight. First, we'll talk about how to manage EPRs and EDOs in light of the recently published guidance, what's changing, what's still unclear, and how companies can get ahead. We'll then talk about post-approval changes and bridging strategies, especially when modifications affect one constituent part but ripple through the entire system. Will then lead to the practical integration of drug, device, and CMC requirements where technical details meet organizational challenge. And finally, the still evolving landscape of UDI for combination products, what's clarified, what remains a question mark, and how global requirements may shape the path ahead. Whether you're a regulatory professional, a quality leader, or a design engineer, or someone who's simply fascinated by the complexity of modern therapeutics, I hope this session provides insights you can take back to your daily work. Now I'd like to introduce our guests. First, Jonathan Amaya Hodges. Jonathan is a Director of Technical Services at Suttons Creek, bringing over 16 years of multidisciplinary experience in regulated medical products, drug biologics devices, and combination products alike. His background spans development, quality engineering, and regulatory affairs with special focus on drug delivery, digital health, clinical bridging strategies, and lifecycle management. Jonathan holds a bachelor's in chemical engineering from Northwestern University. Jonathan, go ahead and give us a wave if you could. Just make sure everyone says hi to you. Thank you. Max Lerman. So Max serves as an Associate Director of Solutions Engineering at Suttons Creek. He has a rare combination of regulatory agency and industry background. Prior to joining Suttons Creek, he spent over 3 years at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in the infusion devices team, shaping review practices for infusion pumps, life-critical drug delivery systems, and electroporation technologies. Earlier, he worked in industry at Medtronic and holds a PhD in material science and engineering from the University of Maryland. So Max, go ahead and give us a wave. Last but not least, we have Sarah Malo. Sarah is a principal consultant at Suttons Creek who brings deep regulatory strategy experience in combination products. Her resume includes 6 years at the FDA's CDRH Center of Devices and Radiological Health as a public jurisdiction officer and policy analyst, and earlier roles as a reviewer and team leader for injection device programs. Sarah holds a PhD in immunology from the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Thank you all for joining us. Sarah, go ahead and wave as well. We have 4 topics that could probably take several hours. I think we can all agree on that. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. I really would like to start first with EPRs and EDDOs. What I found in my consulting experience is that while the FDA really intended to provide clarity between EDDOs and EPRs, companies still have a really significant amount of confusion related to really differentiating the two. And the guidance really it was intending to say they're really one and the same. Maybe Sarah, you can start us off. Really from your perspective, what are the most significant shifts in the guidance between EPRs and EDDOs, if there are any really shifts at all? Anything that you can provide some clarity on in terms of how companies should actually assess and apply EDDOs?
Sure. Yeah. So I think where I'd want to start is the FDA really wasn't intending to change what they were asking for in submissions. I think industry really was giving a lot of feedback to FDA that they would like to understand how FDA was arriving at the time EPRs and then what specific information should be included in applications, wanting to see that up front and not necessarily even in a meeting package or in a submission. And so, the team that, drafted that guidance really took that to heart and also took the, critique to the essential performance, the lack of clarity on what that term meant because of some other some other places where that term is used. And so there really wasn't intended to be a shift there wasn't intended to be a change in what was being asked. So, the EPRs and EDDOs, just really looking at, the specifications, the attributes, the functions of the, device that if those specifications are met, the drug is getting to the appropriate site at the appropriate time, at the appropriate amount. And just really, and if you have one of the devices that are, used as examples, I think it's fair to just, those are the things that FDA will likely consider. And so it's, you can focus on those for performance. I think if you have a novel device, then you can use the thinking to kind of come up with your own. And then the other really important thing I think is the risk. Like FDA tried to really clarify that risk doesn't come into play when it comes into EDDO selection, but I do think it's definitely in the guidance explaining that you can consider risk in terms of the type of testing. So the level of verification evidence, the type of control strategy, whether or not it's instability, that all, it's not just, it's an EDDO, so you have to have the same level of information. Dose accuracy and cap removal force will likely have very different information supporting. So I think those are the things that I think are most important. And I guess to get back to your question, I didn't see it as a shift. I think it was really intended just to clarify, but I do understand the ambiguity. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the change in term created a bit of a view that this might be an actual shift, when the reality was that the FDA was just to provide the clarity because of the confusion related to the term itself. I think where a lot of that confusion came in was, when the concept of primary functions was kind of right about the same time. So you have now primary functions through the 11608 standards, and then you have the EDDOs that kind of seem similar in concept, but we're quite looking at things from a different perspective. Maybe Jonathan, you can give me your perspective on really how companies might approach dealing with those differences between, or even defining what the primary functions really were intended to be versus the EDDO.
Yeah, I think going back, it's good to look at the intent of each, and the intent for primary function, I think, is on the technical side. It obviously comes from 11608-1, the 2022 revision, and it was something that was in the works for years as that standard went through its approval process. But it's associated with the functionality of the product and identifying the most important functions of the device and making sure you have the right level of testing for those in terms of the statistics behind it and in terms of preconditioning and other such aspects. Now, on the EPR EDDO side, that really has regulatory intent, and there's some overlap of the two. In fact, many times maybe they overlap completely, but sometimes they form a Venn diagram with some offset. And from the regulatory purpose, it's what the regulators care the most about. Again, it could be in terms of the performance of the device or the outputs of the design process, but it's really what they want to review and do that in a somewhat standardized way, realizing that there are various permutations of combination products, even the same type of combination product, be it a prefilled syringe, auto-injector. There are different forms and form factors, and so it's hard to strictly apply the same prescriptive list to all of them. And there have been lists floating around over the years. There have been lists discussed in presentations, but generally speaking, the guidance should accommodate any variety of combination product from that perspective. So it gives them at least a standardized construct of what they're looking at. And the way I like to think about it is combination products that are regulated as drugs don't have these as special controls typically associated with class 2 medical devices that are based in the regulations or guidance issued on that specific subject. Those don't really exist for combination products that are otherwise regulated as drugs or biologics. And again, it gives a standardized methodology of looking at the product. So looking at the intent, you have primary function on the technical side, what you really need to focus on with your testing, your design verification testing and shelf life testing, all that. And then you have the regulatory intent, what you're going to focus your submission around. Also, some other documentation like control strategies for manufacturing purposes, and how that's conveyed in the respective regulatory filing.
Yeah, I think that's good insight. Max, you've had some experience with kind of some novel products, right? And we know that EDDOs apply to kind of all drug delivery devices. Do you have any recommendations on kind of an approach? Again, primary functions aren't necessarily at play with these novel injection devices because the 11608 standard may not apply. But do you have an approach to how you might recommend companies to kind of take the EDDOs and apply them to kind of a novel delivery device?
Yeah, I do commend this too about that guidance document, and taking a step away from the individual terminology. A lot of what's done in that guidance is to present a way of thinking how to approach this problem. And at the end of the day, the question is hopefully pretty simple. What needs to get done for the drug to be delivered? And it's a very fundamental question that you as a designer, as a quality expert, as a regulator, you can take that back to your team and think about, especially in these more novel presentations, what is, based on the system design, the users, what about that ecosystem is really critical for you to consider in your delivery system, and then present that in that manner. So it's, again, presenting a method of critically analyzing these systems, distilling that up, and then presenting that to a regulator in a concise manner. And right, as Jonathan was saying, it is a kind of a way of akin to special controls. At the end of the day, the review bar for these drug-led combination products is going to be safe and effective. So they're going to be held to the same standard as PMA type devices, and the expectations are similarly high. So even if the risks may be lower for an individual device constituent, the actual review practices are not necessarily there. So this gives you a kind of framework of best consolidating, summarizing, and presenting those key attributes for regulators so that you and they are on the same page of what is most critical and most important throughout your design cycle and the product life cycle, that you're keying in on and ensuring safety and efficacy of the product.
Yeah, I think you said something in there that I think is, I always like to break things down to kind of the most simple terms, right? What do you, and when I think about EDOs, I kind of try to do this where it's, what do you need to do to deliver your drug product? I mean, it really comes down to, it's truly that simple, right? What steps are you going to have to do in order to make sure that that drug actually gets delivered? So when we talk about EDDOs and what you're going to test and what you're going to assess as part of both design verification and your release control strategy is really, what is it going to do to, if this fails and you can't deliver drug, well, yes, you should consider that potentially an EDDO, and it's really that simple. I kind of worry sometimes that some of our clients and other companies I've worked with, they overanalyze it, right? So they get to the point, they look at every single function of the device. They go through, this detailed analysis when it's really simple. It's like, have you taken the product out of the box? Have you used it? Those handful of steps that, if they didn't work, would not deliver the device. Those are probably your EDDOs. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that we get in the engineering mindset and we try to over-engineer EDDOs, which then has a huge impact on our control strategies, which increase costs significantly to try to implement all those tests. When you really go back to your simplest concept of saying, well, does it impact my ability to deliver the drug? And if the answer is no, well, it still may be, if it has a safety aspect, it may have other implications such as primary function, or you may need to test it to be safe and effective, to your point, Max, but it may not be considered an EDDO. So kind of open it up to the team. Any other kind of comments that you think would be kind of people really need to to understand in order that you've seen maybe companies fail and struggle with this that you think would be valuable for the people viewing?
I think, Rob, like you were stating about overcomplicating things, overthinking it is the direction I see people getting in the most trouble, where they make life too difficult for themselves and they don't really, again, try to work towards the intent of the guidance to consolidate down and focus your attention on the parts that really matter. Instead, they get caught up in the details and what that means and in implementing it in a convoluted way within their quality management system, within their DHF, et cetera. And then again, they cause themselves to stumble, if anything else. So I think trying to think about it in the lens of this is focusing our attention on it, the core aspects that matter for the function of this product, instead of, okay, well, we need to put everything in the kitchen sink in here and over engineer it.
Yeah, and I do think it's important because reviewers, there's a lot of applications they're reviewing, and really making sure the information in the submission is focused on what they are looking for, cuts down questions, should shorten review time. And I think, one goal of the guidance was to have that information up front. I do think that was, the purpose, and can be helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's right. I think it does everyone a true justice by having those things simply stated. These are things we consider most critical. We want you similarly embracing this concept too, so we're all on the same page. Hopefully there aren't any surprises, and should there be any questions, it's very clear kind of what our basis is, where we're coming from, and why we're driving everyone towards this shared understanding of what is most critical in our delivery systems.
Because I do worry that the issue that people have is not thinking that they really do have to throw everything at every EDO. And I just want to double down on, if you think based on the risk of the product, of the function failing, but it's still an EDO based on function, the level of information that you provide in terms of verification and control strategy really can, you can have rationales and a lower amount of information that's supported based on that information. So I feel like that's important. I think people would be less fighting against, if something wasn't EDDO, if you realize that that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a release test or just really rigorous verification. You can just have in-process controls or something like that.
Yeah, the in-process controls and the opportunities to reduce the release testing is really a critical element that, again, it's part of a critical control strategy, and it should be considered. If you can test that in the upstream process and justify why that's adequate, it's certainly something that I've seen, FDA strongly considers. Not everything has to be that release test, right? So you really want to reduce that burden as much as possible. So I hate to move us along, because I know we could talk about this quite literally for hours, but we do have a couple other topics I want to get to. I want to talk a little bit about kind of post-approval changes and bridging guidance. And this is, again, a very broad topic, and I kind of want to break it down maybe quickly into kind of just two quick tidbits, because I think, again, this is another topic we could spend hours on. Let's first talk about post-approval changes. I think one of the challenges industry has is, when you talk about post-approval changes, what's reportable and what's not in the combination product world, and how do you make that assessment? How do you determine what's reportable and what type of reportable given the current guidance, which is challenging, right? Because there's not clear combo product guidance that says, with this change, you have to report under this banner. So just going to open up to anyone who wants to kind of answer. What would be the guidance for a company? Kind of where's the starting point for assessing change? And what mechanism should be put in place to have some, appropriate controls to ensure the device constituent or the combination product is appropriately reviewed internally for reportability.
Yeah, I say, I know Rob, you and I and others on this call too, love to spit this answer back to our clients, and I'm going to give the unfortunate consulting response, but it really depends. But I think that there are some baselines to start with, right? Like the basic question: what are really, what are the risks related to our delivery system? And are there any equivalencies we can draw on from a more device-centric approach? So is there a 510K basis? Is there a PMA basis that we can draw some approximate reliability to that, or other existing guidance documents or standards that kind of define what a change for that kind of system would define. There's also the approach to look more classically with NDAs and ANDAs and how they define various types of changes and then bucket and categorize those. And I think that you unfortunately have to look and consider those and other types of inputs and kind of come to some kind of scorecard assessment of these, right? That one should tend to err on side of caution, over report as opposed to under report, because there just are further risks with underreporting. But in general, there are ways that you can think critically and say, at the end of the day, is this a specification change? Well, is it just because the specification change related to the device or to the drug, right? You can substitute the word combination product and you can make some educated guesses based on that. Is it a change to the manufacturer? Is it a change to the labeling? And you can go down that kind of same path. So they're kind of footholds to draw on from these places, but you're absolutely right. There's no single unified place that's going to list out every single one of these things, and for good or bad, because they're so varied that it does force some onto the initiator of that change to make some risk-based determinations.
Yeah, Jonathan or Sarah, any additional commentary from either of you?
This is a long-standing challenge, right? Because let's take a drug-led combination product. You have the drug regulations, which were written for drug product, that give a risk-based approach to post-market changes. There's some specificity around there, but it's basically the round hole they're trying to fit the square peg into that is the device constituent of a combination product. And on the device side, you have basic concepts that don't apply really well at all, like the 510K change guidance, which is applicable to class 2 devices, of which many device constituents of combination products would fit, but it's a foreign concept and the two don't mesh together. Now there have definitely been attempts to try and do it. I think the best guidance is probably in FDA's ICHQ 12 implementation guidance, which goes through basically post-approval lifecycle management for drugs on the ICH side. But there was a very specific effort to include combination products, drug-like combination products, in the scope. And so I would reference there first. There are some good examples and flow diagrams that are included there. There's some training materials where some examples are included directly from ICH on top of FDA's implementation guidance. So that's one place to look. One place to probably not look is the much older FDA draft guidance on post-market change for combination products. I think it was from circa 2013. And there's been a long-standing effort to change that. It's on FDA's guidance agenda for updating, but as we've recently heard from the Office of Combination Products, that's a work in progress. And so you got to kind of fit together the pieces, maybe with some level of guidance from ICHQ 12, but really looking at your own submission, looking at the wording of the various regulations as it applies to the other constituent part, and trying to fit your square peg into that round hole as best you can, and really explaining yourself in the submission, be it in the cover letter or elsewhere in your documentation, so that the reviewers understand what you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing, and making sure things get routed to the right place. Like, okay, this is a device constituent issue. A CDRH consulting reviewer should be looking at this. Here's what they're looking for. And each change is different, but ultimately changes are inevitable. Everybody will deal with this multiple times hopefully many times for a given product, because hopefully it's successful and on the market for a long period of time, which means it will undergo a lot of changes, planned and unplanned. And for now, that means putting the pieces together yourself and trying to create a justification, and trying to leverage your resources to confirm that.
Yeah, and I think that kind of ties into the second piece, which is really how much governance should you have? What's the appropriate governance when you're performing the reviews of these changes? I think it's easier for large pharma because they have the personnel on staff to be able to help assess the change and make the determination, is this reportable? Was it content that's in the submission that needs to be changed? What is the potential safety or efficacy impact? I think small pharma is challenged, right? A lot of times they don't have device people or device regulatory people on staff. So how do you make that assessment? I think that's really critical, that companies don't dismiss these changes as, oh, they're small, they're trivial. They can have consequential impact on your submission and require a significant amount of reportability, which also ties into your overall strategy. When do you implement these? What's the timing of that? Because some of these changes, especially if you're a global submission, could take quite a long time. You need to build up inventory and do all those things to implement these changes, potentially in a phased approach. So with that, I do want to pivot kind of to the second half of this, which is clinical bridging. And I think this is another area similar to EDDOs that companies just really struggle to understand, where you're going from device A to device B. What do we need to do clinically to ensure that this device has appropriate testing and the FDA is going to agree that we're doing that, especially when you have very similar devices like a prefilled syringe to an AI, and what are those considerations? So Sarah, do you have any general comments kind of on what companies should be looking for in that approach? And we can use the example of maybe a prefilled syringe to an auto injector as something that can kind of maybe baseline us.
Sure. Yeah. So I think starting with, I think the biggest thing is can't just point to another program, another injector, and say this is the same. You can absolutely bridge, but there needs to be an assessment or a very clear kind of outlining of what are the differences. And that includes any kind of stacking of differences, and then what could those differences impact. So if you whatever you're marketing as compared to what you provided testing on, just being really clear on what the differences are, and why, either providing then supportive information that would cover those differences, or providing rationale for why, yes, that difference could have a potential to impact the testing, the information that was provided, but here's why it wouldn't for XYZ reasons. And I feel like that sounds simple, but I did see when I was at the agency a lot of, this injector is the same, but then it turns out there are changes to, certain, parts of the components to help with different, it's on a different line, or the fill volume is slightly different, and the drug is, there's all these different changes that there might still be leverageable information, but you just being upfront about, here's what the difference is, and here's the information we have to support that this other information over here is bridgeable. I think for the AI, the prefilled to AI, I think it's likely that at minimum, the agency is going to want to see PK bioequivalence, but I still don't think it's a foregone conclusion that if you have real supportable information for why the difference between those two things would not impact clinical endpoints, you can propose that with, again, really good, strong supportive rationale and evidence. I would recommend having that in a meeting, kind of doing that as early as possible to give yourself time in case there's, it's not accepted. But yeah, I think the take home point is just really being clear about what the differences are, not just saying there are differences, and kind of putting yourself in the reviewer's shoes. You're essentially saying you can use this information over here, and then you're saying that there's XYZ differences. How do they know that when those things combine, all those differences are stacked together, that there wouldn't be a difference? Like you clearly know that. That's why you're proposing that. Why, what is that information that you have, and just give that to the reviewer so they can accept it. 'Cause I think that they don't really want to ask additional questions if it's clear.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge I see consistently is, a lot of companies want to leverage not only their own internal platform, but they often want to leverage a competitor's platform, and they know, hey, they use the same platform device we do. It's the same general indication. Can't we just leverage that data? And it's like, well, no, right? You have no access to that data. You have no authority to use that data. So you can leverage your internal platform, just like you said, Sarah, right? You have to do the assessment of change. Are you using a different power pack? Are you using a different safety mechanism? Is there slight design changes from presentation A to presentation B? And all of those have to be assessed. I think that's kind of the really important thing. And then I agree with you on the PK/PD studies. Like the default is always, yeah, you'll probably have to do them, but you might have that opportunity. And I've seen it personally at least once where the FDA said, yeah, we understand your rationale going from a prefilled syringe to an AI. In that particular patient population, in that presentation, there was a lot of unique elements to it, which got them to agree to say, yeah, you don't need the additional study. And I still think the default is, yes, you'll probably need one, but I think there is opportunities there. Max or Jonathan, any additional comments on this particular one? I know, Jonathan, you've done a ton of work in bridging for us here at Suttons Creek. Any feedback?
The adage of it depends definitely comes into play. Each circumstance is different. What you're bridging from and to matter. The drug matters. Its general PK profile, the dose frequency and dose regimen matter. The usability impact matters. So you're touching potentially different aspects of it, but that varies each and every time. So your bridging package very well looks different, and this depends on which part of the product life cycle you're into. If you're still in clinical development, which phase you're in. If you're in the post-market, what data already exists or does not. And so Sarah's point about going to talk to the regulators, FDA specifically, is almost always applicable because each circumstance is different. And FDA in their draft bridging guidance from 2019, I believe, does a good job of giving you a construct to work through. And it's pretty straightforward. It's like 5 steps, and you go through, see what data you're trying to leverage, what data you have to prove equivalency, comparability, and then making an argument as to what you need to do to bridge the gap and why. And then you can talk to FDA about that, and give yourself enough time, hopefully, in case you have to do something like a PK study. Like Rob said, that's probably the norm, the part that you work from, and you try to maybe pare it back based on data that you already have, or or have access to Rob's point, and then talk to them and get confirmation. But because of the just differences, it's hard to give overarching specific advice that would work each and every time, because what you're trying to completely avoid is a brand new efficacy study, of course. And again, usually PK can build that bridge, but you're trying to avoid having to redo everything from scratch. But it's highly dependent on circumstances. It's good to try to think ahead while you're in development to see, okay, well, what directions could this go? How do we prepare ourselves now? How do we best characterize the product now so that we have a starting point, a foothold for the bridge if we're going to build that eventually in the future?
Yeah, I want to ask a slightly different question to Max, because it's one that comes up, but it's related to the same topic, which is we're not using our device in our phase 3. Right? We're bridging from, let's say, a prefilled syringe to an AI or on-body system, whatever the case may be. We're not using it in our phase 3. What's the likelihood of us needing to run a separate clinical study to be able to get this device approved? Any thoughts there? Because I know this is opening a can of worms, so
Yeah.
we'll have to keep it brief. But I just wanted to know what kind of how your approach might be to this.
Yeah, and I'd say it is a wild card, but I would go on a limb and say, hopefully not. But I think that if you use good engineering practices, and I know maybe you intended this from a drug equivalency of our first topic or not, but defining EDDOs early is one of those things that, hey, that's probably going to help you here. Like if you can show that delivery system A and delivery system B, for all intents and purposes, the same essential drug outputs do apply. There's a lot to be said that show, hey, these things are basically functioning the same, and that they're achieving the same. They should achieve the same clinical effect. We're getting the same dose in the same patient population at the same time. Those are with some additional things, the same basic premise that you're trying to achieve within a clinical bridge. And I know it's something that we've all had conversations about as well. Maybe it's a paper bridge. It's not a clinical study, but how are we paper bridging? And I think there are ways that you can take a step back, viewing your entire clinical development program and trying to draw those through lines, saying, how do I draw these equivalencies from the start to show that there's relatively low risk and relatively low need to add additional clinical studies to kind of further prove my point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Hate to jump to the next topic, but I think we're getting close on time. So I think the last two topics we might be able to get through a little quicker, but I think they're important to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of drug and device CMC requirements, and I want to focus, I think, very specifically on, there are a couple of drug requirements that apply to the device and vice versa, right? They're very kind of, I wouldn't even say they're not even tangentially related, they're directly related. And so there's oftentimes a question, concern, well, do I put these in my device input requirements, or do I put these in my drug documentation? And there's some resistance and good reasons for both, right? So with that, I'm just going to open it up to the group and say, do you have any best practice recommendations? I know we've talked about it internally, and I think there's reasons to do it both ways, but any best practice recommendations?
I guess I'll chime in. I kind of call these crossover topics between device and CMC. It could include container closure integrity, extractables, leachables, some other sterility related items, maybe particulate matter, items related to the directly drug facing components that are selected but function as devices, like the piston syringe. My opinion is that it's really best to capture these within the design history file as design inputs, design outputs, verification data, etc. You're going to be generating the data regardless. It's a clear regulatory expectation. There are USP chapters about all these and/or applicable ISO standards or other types of standards. And so you're going to be collecting the data. It doesn't have to be performed by the device team per se. It could be led oversight by the CMC or drug product team, and then you just reference the data at the end of the day. Now you need to understand what the acceptance criteria are and gain alignment on that, but this is a good way to do it. And if you're following QBD, quality by design, over on the drug side anyway per ICH, then you're likely doing the same type of exercise. So this is just one way to document it. Now, as we were stating in an earlier topic, in terms of overcomplication, if it becomes overcomplicated, then maybe find some other way to deal with it. It shouldn't be overcomplicated, at least on face value. If there are issues found during testing, then maybe that's another matter. But on its face, how you're documenting it and handling it should be straightforward and consistent with other requirements, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought of it, traceability is key, right? If you can show traceability in the same way, if you used a third-party test lab or you're referencing a master file, you may not capture that, or capture that in a slightly different way in your design input requirements, and your evidence is going to be somewhere else. That's okay, as long as you show traceability and those documents and those external systems are controlled. What's the challenge? What's the problem? DHF doesn't necessarily have to say you have to contain them all within this single file structure, right? You can reference other audited supplier quality systems, and it's okay if you have a Part 4 based system, and you have control over your 210, 211 drug side. Well, then where's the issue? That's kind of the way I approach it. Sarah, Max, anything else from your perspective?
I was just going to add to that. Right, I think there's things to think about. Right, what makes the most sense for you? How are you collecting and then reporting out these data? Or are you looking for a U.S. focused dossier or more globally focused dossiers? What does it make sense for flexibility from a now versus a later perspective? Are you looking to leverage this across these data across various platforms? Or you're limiting it to just the single drug asset? So there's other questions to consider. For a specific drug program, how does it relate to your pipeline projector for this product, your intended global footprint, and maybe future applications that you're looking to draw out. I know there are instances of like internal teams having need to kind of align on reporting needs and data sharing needs, and that's something that you need to kind of sort out within your own house before you're kind of presenting a foot forward to the FDA or any other regulator for that matter. But just to put a bow on your traceability thing, because of the maybe lack of clarity where these data can be located, absolutely put together a device content related reviewer's guide whenever you submit something to the US FDA, because the data could be, in some cases, 4, 5, 6, 7 different places. And unfortunately or fortunately, it's on you to tell your story.
Well, yeah, and I think that's kind of I think I want to get to with, for the advice we're going to provide people watching this. I mean, Max, Sarah, you were both reviewers, right? Did you care? Did you care whether it was in the drug file or the device file? No,
I only cared I could find it.
No, yeah, I was always floored or really happy if there was a reviewer guide and it was very clear, because then you can just get to it quickly, which means if you have questions, you can ask those quickly. Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, it's kind of one of these things, like we get in this analysis paralysis sometimes, right? Where we're so worried about where things should be from, oh, well, this system is set up in such a way. Well, the reality is when you get to the brass tacks and you get into review, as long as you're able to show where that information is and tell the reviewer where it is, whether it be an auditor or a reviewer, it doesn't really matter. As long as you can show traceability to that, that's the key, right? So make it simple, kind of the KISS method, right? Like keep it simple, make sure that you're showing traceability. And then whether you put it as a design input requirement or it's just a drug and you just reference that, the reality though, I think to Jonathan's point, is you can't ignore the fact that it's still a requirement, right? It's still the drug device interaction. So the requirement to me seems applicable to be in the device DIR, but where you put the evidence and where you trace to is less important, right? As long as you can show that traceability.
Yeah, Robin, I like that. I like the idea of it at least being an input requirement, because then that the device and the CMC teams are talking and making sure that the device considerations are really kind of considered. But yeah, tracing to where the data is held, holds no, that's completely fine. But at least that way, if there's a requirement within the HF, it's been the device role, the actual, for example, auto injector has been considered.
Perfect. Well, I know we're kind of down to the last few minutes and we have one more topic to get to. So let's kind of dive into that. And that's really kind of UDI for combination products. We don't get a ton of questions on UDI, but when it comes up, it's one of these things we know has impact, right? Because you talk about serialization, that has huge impact. Labeling has a huge impact in terms of, setting up systems and making sure you have the right content, because you don't want to be at the 11th hour and have the wrong, information on your label, knowing that that's going to delay potential launches and cause other issues. So I'm just going to, again, open it up to the team and say, what's the general feedback for the challenges we've seen related to UDI to devices? And maybe we should start on kind of integrated combination products or integral combination products in EU terms. What would be the appropriate method for UDI, or how would you, I guess, approach that if you just had no idea which method you should be using?
I think the good thing is the single entity aspects are pretty straightforward and are described in FDA's draft guidance from earlier this year. which is basically follow what applies the primary mode of action. On the device side, you have the UDI as the two components, PI and DI. And if you're drug or biologic led, then you follow the drug side. It has an NDC number, but it also, at the carton level at least, has an SNI or serialization. So it makes it pretty straightforward there. Now, if a company has a type of product, primary mode of action that's different than their typical products, say for instance a device-led combination product or even just a separate device at a drug company, then that can cause some challenges or at least some confusion as the company tries to figure out how to do UDI when they're used to doing serialization. They're analogous, but they're not equivalent. So there can still be confusion there, but thankfully the situation seems to be mostly straightforward. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Sarah, I think we've had a conversation in the past where, really talking about the intent of the regulation. And, when you talk about, well, what would apply to a drug, a device, a combination product, the idea was, well, are you meeting the intent of the regulation? Can you show traceability? Do you know what the device is? If it's separate from the box, and using that logic kind of to apply the appropriate methodologies. Do you have any insight, given your experience in policy, kind of the thought process behind that? Is it really about the intent of the regulation, or is it much more strict than that?
I do think that you're absolutely right that it is about the intent. And I think, I completely agree with what Jonathan's saying. And I think if, again, like as we've said before, if you have any questions, it's, always a good idea to ask, or just go with what you think makes sense with the regulation. Make sure you document that of your rationale as to why. And I think it's unlikely that if you're doing something that is, that you're able to rationalize it and provide support for why you're doing something a certain way, that FDA would really go after you. And if they did, that you would have, documentation that would kind of explain your thinking. And so I think, I agree.
Yeah, and I can talk to a specific example product that I worked on, which was a reusable auto injector. And we really kind of thought about the potential for UDI. This was about the time where the guidance came out. We're like, well, how does this apply? Because the drug product was shipped separately from the device. And so it's like, well, now is this a standalone device? And then how do you label it? And ultimately we landed on the NDC, and the NDC was traceable, on the box for the auto injector, also on the box for the drug. And the reality was, we said, well, the intent of this is to be able to trace, to figure out what device is this, what's the name, what's the intended use, what are those elements, and then the device itself was serialized. So if we ever had a recall, we could say it's this NDC number, this is the product name, here's the serial numbers that are impacted, and does that meet the intent of the regulation? And the answer ultimately was yes. And the FDA didn't challenge us and said, yeah, that's fine. So it's kind of interesting in that, if you take a very kind of a black and white approach to UDIs, it becomes, again, very confusing. But if you say, what is the intent of the regulation and how do we apply it? It seems to be much easier to say, okay, well, we have lots of flexibility here. It doesn't have to be quite so strict. Max, any final comments on this particular topic?
Yeah, just to add that there are a lot of ways to skin this cat, and I'll say there are a lot of good ways and probably some not as great, but it's a lot easier to have a conversation with someone of, I did it this way and here's why, right? Like, you can have a much more engaging and meaningful conversation with whomever, an auditor, a regulator, an external partner, this is why I've made this decision. Here's my logic. If you disagree, that's fine. But now we have a meaningful basis to have a true conversation. And if you agree with the logic, then the output should basically come hand in hand. And I know that applies to a lot of what it is in our business. But this is one of those topics where there's so many ways to address this problem when it comes up. Particularly in clinical trials, let's say, when the requirements for EDI are, a little bit even more vague. So right, there's a lot to unpack here potentially. So there's a lot of, let's say, the onus and the pressures on you to be very clear on your reasons and your logic.
Thanks, Max. Well, I think with that, that brings us to the end of today's conversation. We've really covered a lot of ground today. I want to have a huge thank you to the guests, Jonathan, Max, Sarah, for bringing clarity, expertise, and nuance to some of these really challenging areas within our industry. Your insights really help all of us think more critically about the systems, decisions, and trade-offs that shape our kind of combination product development. So stay tuned for future conversations where we continue to unpack these types of issues. And thank you for your time. I'm really excited to see where our conversations go next. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.